Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for coming here for the 10th podcast of Common Ground. And we're super excited to bring our guests, Jason Hartman and Rollo Tomassi. Jason Hartman's a friend of mine who runs a really cool podcast where he's brought on guests such as Jordan Peterson, Thomas Sowell, Peter Zeihan. He worked as a real estate syndicalist for decades and is friends with everyone in the dating men's community. And that leads on to Rollo Tomassi, the author of The Rational Male and one of the founders of the current men's dating movement. He's spoken at many events, has made appearances in things such as Fresh and Fit, and excited to have you both here.
Thanks for having us.
I also have my co-host, David Hamilton, who is the founder of the America's Future series, hosts political events, and also wrote a book many years ago, The Nice Guy's Guide to Dating. So we're going to have a conversation here about the problems that we see with modern dating. As I've said in many of my videos, and my specialty is anthropology, politics, history, the sexual dating crisis is the number one problem our society faces. And if we don't deal with it, I think it'll have major social and political repercussions. So,
yeah, Rudyard, it's odd. I think a lot of people who are out of the loop on this would find it odd for someone to say that's the biggest problem.
The reason I say that,
I think you're right, because look, anything that controls the birth rate is huge, right? That has giant impact on society for decades.
I don't say it lightly because statistically, no country in the industrialized world, and even countries like India or Indonesia now, have declining birth rates. And a society without a stable birth rate, for China or Germany or those countries, they'll have two 80-year-olds for each 35-year-old. And that is the death of the modern industrial world. And if you look among young people, 2/3 of young men ages 18 to 30 are single. For guys my age, I guess the number is around 80%. 1/3 of men under the age of 30 are virgins. And people just aren't getting married. And I have all these statistics for once the average age of marriage goes above 28, you're going to have a revolution. And this is held true for thousands of years because humans are biological creatures. And having a large group of sexually frustrated young men is absolute revolution fodder. And people don't connect this, but it's a precedent we've seen dozens of times before. And at the same time, female mental health is at the worst levels of history. And so if you look at something like the French Revolution, people at the time didn't think. People turned what was really a social and political problem. People are hungry, they can't get married. It became a political problem of let's kill the elite. And I think the same thing's going to happen to us because, and I've said this in several videos, we're already seeing basically large groups of sexually frustrated young men turn into political radicalism. And even among older men, divorce is 50% of marriages. Lots of sexless, loveless marriages, and men work hard to basically get laid. And once that gets removed, society starts to fall apart. And there are loads of books that talk about once you mess up sexual incentives among men, your society is going to fall apart.
I'm working presently on I don't know if I'm going to turn it into a book of some sorts, but I'm working on a series of essays. And they focus and they center primarily on the year 1965 and 1965 through 1975. And you being sort of a demographer / anthropologist, sociologist, you might find this interesting that whenever I'm talking about the confluence of like, say, red pill stuff or like intersexual dynamics and like political things, I guess, the crossover between those two, they all track back to one invention in 1965, and that is hormonal birth control. And so that's when things started to become, you'll see social unrest right during that period, the civil rights, a lot of the stuff that was going on back then. Then you've got the sexual revolution that comes in the wake of the popularizing or the sort of ramping up of hormonal birth control. By the way, hormonal birth control was existed in 1960, but didn't really get pushed until about 65. for the baby boom generation that was going on at the time, the free love movement, the sexual revolution that came in the wake of all of that. Then you've got, Playboy magazine, you've got like the rise of militant feminism. If you go and you look between the years of 1965 and 1975, that decade, that 10-year span right there, and you look at all of the social and civil changes that have happened in the wake of hormonal birth control, it'll blow your mind. Because I mean, you look at like just the sexual revolution is just one pinpoint on a much larger map there. So if you look at the rise of hormonal birth control and you look at the spike in divorces that happened at the same time, there, now granted, correlation is not causation, but it's a hell of a correlation. I mean, it almost tracks identically with the rise in the use of hormonal birth control and the rise in divorce. Also at the same time, you've got Betty Friedan, you've got Gloria Steinem, you've got Our Bodies Ourselves, you've got, the feminine mystique, all that stuff that's coming out during the late 60s into the early 70s. All of that is coming as a result of really the invention that places the control of human reproduction in the hands of one sex. And that is the first time in the history of humanity that something like that has happened. And so I have and one of my fourth book is called Religion. I actually outline this part here. I make the claim that that hormonal birth control, the invention of hormonal birth control, has been more significant an invention to humanity than the atom bomb, because nothing has done more to change the course of human reproduction than hormonal birth control. And so if you look at that and then you look at, say, the divorces that spike, well, what happens in 1968? Ronald Reagan legalizes no-fault divorce, and year by year by year, all the other states follow suit as a result of that. That's not because it's trying to be some sort of progressive, sort of feminist, law. It's meant to accommodate all of the divorces that are happening as a result of the sexual revolution. Then you see the rise of Title IX. Then you see Roe versus Wade, was 1972, something like that. And then you see we go off the gold standard in 1971. You see average wages stay the same, but production skyrockets as a result of women coming into the workplace as a result of what? The hormonal birth control and being able to prolong and push out the age with which they're going to either have children or they're going to get married, if they get married at all. Gloria Steinem famously says, some of us are becoming the men that we wanted to marry, which today is getting repeated in 2023 on the shows that I go to, which is funny because the girls who who blather this stuff off, they don't know where it came from. Then I love this one. The funniest one I've ever got was, I think it was in 1974. Women were just like, especially today, are saying, "Oh, I can't believe that women couldn't have a bank account or they couldn't have credit cards because the fiendish husbands wouldn't allow it, or just the powers that be." And then suddenly in 1974, we were liberated by being able to have our own lines of credit and our own bank accounts. And I'm like, no, they gave that. The insurance companies gave that to you, and the credit companies gave that to you because we're on a fiat currency now as of 1971, and they just want more participants to play in the game, right? It had nothing to do with feminism. It had everything to do with economics at that time. But and then finally, the last thing you were saying is talking about like how important it is for like fertility rates. I keep seeing this get real. It happens every election cycle, and we're about to go into one. But I love how we always hear about the crisis of under replacement level fertility rates. Well, if you go back and you look at the stats and you look at the, really where fertility rates were in the mid 70s, we've been below fertility rate or below replacement fertility rates in this country since like the late 70s. The time to start banging the gong would have been like 1978, not 2023. So, I mean, we're already that far down the rabbit hole right now. So I think it's interesting to see how people are picking up on this, like in the 21st century.
So if I might, I grew up during the time period you're describing. I'm in my 60s, and I experienced all the things and saw all the things that you're talking about. These things have continued to progress, and the situation, the disconnect between men and women seems to have grown greater and greater. Back to Rudyard's point, though, it's not just a sexual thing. This is a relationship thing and a societal thing. If men don't feel connected, if they don't feel part of society, if they're not married with children, et cetera, right? If they're atomized, why do they have any stake in the outcomes or the well-being of a nation? And similarly for women, if we're all atomized and all we care about is ourselves and we have no connection, then we focus predominantly on hedonism, our own self-interest, et cetera. And therefore, we also don't feel like we have any kind of connection, and we are more and more dissatisfied with our lives. So I'd like you guys to speak a little bit about that. I mean, I saw all the things play out that you're talking about. Now, my mom did have a checking account and a credit card because she was a single mom, raised 3 kids, and she had to have those, and she could get those in the 70s. Maybe she couldn't have gotten them in the 60s. I don't know, but it's interesting. I'm very pro-female. I'm an avowed feminist. I grew up promoting the ERA. And I marched and led marches for the Equal Rights Amendment. But that doesn't mean you need to be anti-male. And it seemed that the feminist movement has become progressively strident and angry, et cetera, and is focused primarily on how to do away with or do without men. So, and that is not good for our society. So I'd love for you guys to speak on those concepts, if you would, for a second.
Sure.
Yeah, just a couple comments on what Rollo was saying before we move on. I just wanted to clarify when he mentioned that Ronald Reagan legalized no-fault divorce. I think that was just a tectonic shift in everything, because there was no penalty to continue hypergamous attitudes in women. They basically got rewarded for it. And by the way, that happened not when Reagan was president. It happened when he was governor of California in 1969. So just 4 years after the pill gained hold, and we know what was happening. The country was falling apart. We had Woodstock, free love, Vietnam War protests, et cetera, et cetera. The legalized divorce, and California starts trends, and it did, and it went all over the nation. Or I mean, no fault divorce. Sorry. So that was a big shift. But even to move back further from where Rollo started in 1965, think about it. If you were in government, if you were in the corporatocracy, if you were a corporate executive, even back to the 50s, think about what your mindset would have been, right? We had this economic boom after World War II, where the baby boomers were building families, doing all the right things, and things started to slow down. And the government might look around and say, hey, we've got half of the workforce not working because they're working in the home and they're not counted. They don't contribute to the tax base. They don't contribute to the GDP of the country. We can't tax them, and we can't say that we have a bigger economy because of them. And if you're so that's government. Then if you're in the corporatocracy, you're thinking, gosh, if everybody's married, they're only using one of everything. They're only using one sofa. They're only using one house. They only have one coffee maker. They only have one refrigerator. If we could breed discontent and split these people up, we could sell 2 of everything and literally double the size of the consumer market by simply getting people to either not marry, or better yet, to get married, then get divorced, because then you keep and do that multiple times. You keep combining and recombining, and that's a lot more sales of every widget in the economy, okay? But also the corporatocracy had another problem in the late 50s. Men, and we've all maybe seen the series Mad Men, right? So in the 50s and the 60s, the workforce was dominated by males, and males were able to command pretty high wages. And the corporatocracy didn't like this. And they thought, gosh, if we could introduce some competition for those jobs and bring the other half of the population into the workforce, it would push wages down, which it did. And today, well, not today, but for the last several decades, they've been doing that with immigration. So it's the exact same principle. Reduce wages, grow the economy, grow the size of the consumer market. And so feminism was a great thing to support. And even before anything I said, it started back with Edward Bernays in the famous parade in the 20s, the Torches of Freedom, where the women took out the cigarettes, and the tobacco companies wanted to grow their market share because half the population, it was unacceptable for them to smoke. So if they could get women to smoke, they could grow their market share. This is all about money. It's just all about money. Anyway, Rollo, I'm sure you have a lot of comments on that.
Sure. Okay, so as far as like 1971 being sort of I guess because they pegged this at 1970, 1971, since it's like right dead center of the of that decade that I was talking about. If you look at like the average age of first birth for women,
Everything changed in 1971.
yeah, everything. Like if you look at from if you track it from 1971 to 2008, the birth rate or the birth age of first birth goes up to 25 years old. Right now, I think it's closer to 30, depending on the country that we're
like
talking
31.
about. Right. If you look at children per women, 1970 to 2015, it drops from 5 in 1970 all the way down to about 2.5 over. And this is worldwide, by the way. This is not just the United States. If you look at the marriages per 1,000 single people from just past post World War II, it spikes because of the baby boom, of course. But then you've got the sexual revolution. It spikes right there, and then it levels off to the lowest rate of marriage in recorded history. Right now, we are at 5.1 per 1,000 people. Right now, they've been keeping these stats since about like 1850. And so today, right now, we are at the lowest rate of marriage in recorded human history. As a result, I would argue of the civil change, the civil unrest and the changes that have happened in the wake of hormonal birth control. If you look at cumulative inflation, you go from 1970 all the way to 2015. It goes from 306.12% in 1970 all the way to 2,326.58% in 2015. If you look at the dual income stats for those times, all tracks back to 1970. Incarceration rates of men goes like skyrockets from 1970 all the way through 2010.
Which is another business.
Children. Here's children born to unwed women. If you look from 1970 all the way to where we're at right now, the present rate for all demographics is 42% of all births in the United States are born out of wedlock.
Wow.
I can give you the demographics for Hispanic, white, and black as well, but the median is 42%. There's just, I mean, I've got a folder full of these stats that I'm using to write all this stuff out. But the long
So
and short,
Rollo, if you would, you started by talking a little bit about hormonal birth control as being one of the drivers, et cetera, of all of this. There were a couple of other dynamics going on that time. One was the civil rights movement and the war on poverty, and trying
All
to
interconnected.
and they're connected. So birth rates, but unwed mother, births to unwed mothers rose. There were a number of different sociological things and government initiatives that contributed to those things.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But I was going to say, like, when everybody asks me about divorce, or like Rudyard was just saying a minute ago, the divorce rate right now is about 50%. Actually, it's 56%. I was just watching a guy who is a divorce attorney, really popular video on YouTube right now, and I think his last name is Sexton or something like that. I really want to get him on my show or get him into Vegas on my other shows and like Access Vegas. And interview the guy, because he's just a fascinating guy. Really great take, because he's been a divorce attorney for a long time, and he talks about all of his experience in sort of like the divorce machine and how guys are sort of taking it and all that. And he's been explaining, like, one of the things he says, and I really wanted to follow up on this point, was he says, we're still the same kind of animals that we used to be, 200,000 years ago, living in hunter-gatherer tribes on the sub-Saharan African, savannas. But we're living in institutions today that are still kind of like inspired by medieval times, right? They're medieval institutions, and we're living in those situations with godlike technology right now. So everything that could be exacerbated by those two institutions, like the human animal, the medieval institutions, is all exacerbated by the fact that we have like this godlike technology, and we have no way to catch up with it at the same time. But yeah, you're right. The whole thing about the civil rights movement, it's like sort of a confluence, a perfect storm of things that were going on at that time. Whether or not it's like sort of this, fiendish plot by some, evil cabal of, world leaders and, men in the, silhouettes and the
Yeah,
smoking.
it may not be a conscious effort.
I don't think
I have an explanation for this.
I don't necessarily think I think it's more of the fact that I think we need that to sort of convince ourselves that we're not as fucked up as we really are. Because that's just that's just the human animal. That's just how we are as people. It's more
They're drivers.
like to realize the enemy's really us, not some, outside, fiendish, Svengali puppet master somewhere.
What
all
I
the things that Jason mentioned are drivers of behavior, and I'm not sure there's an evil cabal, Jason. I think you're thinking that these were motivations, and therefore people didn't want to stand in the way of progress. More women in the workforce, more GDP, more sales, and so people would oppose it. They would go, "That's a good thing, and we should support women's rights, etc." And so there was a natural sort of affinity for that thing, as opposed to some sort of, we have a despotic plan. On the side of the tobacco companies, that's a little different. Yeah, they actually had a plan.
It's a confluence of two variables. The first is that if you look over civilizations, it's normal for a single social class to gain dominance of the civilization. And then if you look at that society's development, everything leads back to what's good for that social class. And it's not conscious. People just follow ideologies that benefit that. And in India, it's the priests. In China, it's the bureaucracy. In medieval Europe, it was the knights and the warriors. But for us, since World War II, it's been the managers. And if you want to look at the direction of society since World War II, what will give a college-educated manager more power? And the reason they want people to be liberated and irresponsible is they're weaker and managers have no power. The reason they want women in the workforce is because women are more docile and easy to manipulate, and women are 85% of consumer spending. And so if you want to manage a group, women are easier to manage than men. The reason they want to replace the police with social workers is because social workers are college-educated people. And if you look at the left, look at their positions, what gives a person with a college degree more power? And the second thing is, have you guys heard of the Mouse Utopia experiment?
Yes.
Yeah, it's terrifying. For the audience, there was this experiment that was run out 30 times in the 60s. And what happened was they put 9 mice in a giant pen, give them infinite food, infinite health, whatever. And then for these over 30 experiments, 9 mice would breed so that there were more than 2,000 mice, but the threshold for the population was 5,000. And then you started to see the breakdown of mouse society, where the mice, they refused to breed. Female mice became significantly more aggressive. There was a giant mouse homelessness crisis. The mice, social structure and ability to cooperate between each other broke down. And what ended up happening was the mouse birth rate collapsed and their society fell apart. And we're seeing this now today, where if you follow what happened in Mouse Utopia, it's the exact same as our societies today. And the thing is, the parts of our brain that relate to sex and emotions are exactly the same between humans and mice. The prefrontal cortex, which is our big difference, doesn't affect it. And also you can see this in a muted form in other periods of history, which is the process called decadence, where the Greeks, the Romans, the Chinese, the Indians, whatever, they also had periods of history where people didn't have kids, values collapsed, etc. But the thing is, it was much more muted because only their upper classes were wealthy enough to go insane. But for us, we're so wealthy, even in the wealthiest period of the Roman Empire, if you were an idiot, you'd still starve. But today, if you're a homeless person, you're not going to starve to death in America. And so with this removal of external pressure, you're seeing Mouse Utopia play out.
Let me respond to that, because people have sent me the Mouse Utopia thing from the 60s. And while I think probably for the time it was pretty significant, I think one of the things that it leaves out, I have one criticism of that. It's the fact that they're mice. Okay. They're not human beings. Okay. So what I was saying before is, like, mice don't have cell phones. Mice don't have the internet. Mice don't.
Worse. for
don't
us.
have global.
Yeah,
Yes,
we have more
exactly.
pressure,
Yeah,
more
they don't
inputs.
have globalization. They don't have a global sexual marketplace. They don't have a globalized economy. They have the very, and it's all happens in a vacuum. So so from that perspective, like Jason's like, yeah, it's worse. Yeah, it is worse. That's what I was saying about it is the one thing I think that a lot of people, particularly of a sort of a conservative mindset, believe is that things happen in cycles. They don't. That's the problem. And I think when we look at like people who say like, what is it? Tough times create strong men create good times create weak men create hard times. And then it goes into this predictable. We want to see, like as human beings, we want to see like recognizable patterns in the chaos so we can predict what's coming next, so we can prepare and plan for it. That's just how we've been since we were, like I said, living in hunter-gatherer tribe back in the day. And we want some sort of predictability in the chaos. And so we tend to think of things in circles or in cycles or in things like, well, the Romans did it this way, and so therefore that's what's going to happen next. No, you're more fucked than you think you are, actually. Because I'll tell you this, whenever I'm describing this sort of want to see like patterns, I go back to watching like something like it was a really great documentary, but it's a documentary called They Shall Not Grow Old. And it's about the kids that joined the army and they joined the military during World War I in, the turn of the century era, like 1912, 1913, 1914 era. And believing that the Great War was just going to be something that was going to be over in 6 months because we're going to fight it the same way that they fought wars all the way through, the 1800s and up to now. And, great grandfather died in the Civil War, blah, blah, blah. It's going to be glorious. We want to go out there and earn our, it's our masculine duty and our honor bound, thing to go and do this, until they met the first 50 caliber machine gun and were mowed down in like in an industrial fashion. It was war on a scale that no one was ever familiar with or ever expected, because the technology had changed to such a degree that we could kill on an industrial scale. Everyone thought it was going to be like riding on horseback with sabers and, muskets and guns and stuff like that, until the reality of it was, mustard gas and fighting in trenches.
That's a good parallel to social media.
And so they think it was going to be this cycle. It was not a cycle, because technology had changed so dramatically that it was killing millions of people on a yearly basis. And now I think the idea that we're going to go back to some sort of golden age, or there's some way to get back to, like, if the idea is this, is like, if it's a cycle and it's bad times now, we can go back to the good times if we just get back in touch with our sort of virtuous, past and everything. That doesn't exist anymore because of that godlike technology that sort of disqualifies the mouse utopia thing, because it's not going to be like that. It's going to be worse.
My job is
the mouse utopia thing is in part about having unlimited resources and no existential threat.
True.
When you have a population that turns inward, right, and has no existential threat, and population gets so great, relationships can break down. Some of those mice, the females, they stopped having children. They also ate them, or they didn't nurse them, et cetera, right? So these pressures caused breakdowns in their individual behavior. I think what we're seeing is the same sort of pressures, and Jason talks about it, you talk about it, Rollo, the pressures that we're seeing exacerbated by godlike technology and the bombarding, et cetera, this information is breaking down our behavior, our thinking, and our relationships in a very dysfunctional way. And the pattern would simply be, if we keep doing this, and I don't have to go back to Roman days, but if this keeps going, we're going to continue to have this fragmented society where people do not feel aligned or part of anything. We don't have any sort of consciousness, some sort of societal cohesiveness, and we do break down. And it's harmful for our children, our education, our GDP, every aspect of our lives. We do have to figure out some way to look at these driving causes and address them. Otherwise, we are doomed, right, for this pattern to continue from, like you started about, from the 70s. Where does this go then if we don't address these things? And if there isn't a reset, where do we end up with our society between the relationship with women and our societal cohesiveness?
Well, guys end up becoming more addicted to their escapes. First of all, their sedations. That's number one. You guys were mentioning something about the fact that, like, guys, and I've dealt with this like for the last like 10 years, the Lost Boys, generation, the guys who just want to drop out. And the guy, like, I constantly get this. You'll see, like, conservative pundits love to harp on this aspect of it because it goes back to sort of like male authority and male responsibility. But it's the idea that, guys need to sort of get off their ass and get going, but there's no incentive for them to do so. And even when they do sort of get off their ass, they're just bombarded with like this idea that it's your masculine duty to do these particular things, and hearkening back to really kind of 20th century ideals in a 21st century reality right now. And then more to your point, I think that the concept of what's called genetic gap. I don't know if you guys are familiar with genetic gap, but what it is it's like I said before, we are still these fundamentally human beings are still the same critters we were back 100,000 years ago, and yet technology advances at such a rapid rate that technology changes our relations, as you were saying before, it changes our relations and how we do family, how we do relationships, how we interact with one another. Like right now, we're talking on Zoom. This is only in this era does all this happen. So we've never been, we're like still that same animal, but we're dealing with a level of communication where we can be like, I don't know, Jason, you're in like what, Palm Beach? I don't know where you're in Texas. I know where you are, but like I'm in Reno, Nevada. And it's like having this conversation would be impossible just like, 20 years ago. So the technology changes at such a rapid rate that human beings are not able to sort of process how to use that either ethically or how to form relationships or what's the best practices to be using that. And the minute we get to the point where we go, okay, this is what we ought to do, the technology has changed like 3 or 4 times before we get to that point, because our ability to process it and digest it and really, develop best practices about it is so slow that technology outpaces our ability to cope with it. So what I see coming up right next is everybody's like, banging the gong about artificial intelligence. So we're still trying to figure out how we should be dealing with Tinder and Bumble and Hinge and, and how dating ought to work and how, we're having this conversation about what are we going to do about society. Meanwhile, AI is changing the game so dramatically right now that by the time we're ready to say, oh, here's what we ought to do, AI's already changed the game. And we don't know what's real and what's not real. And we don't honestly care about what's real or not, as long as the perception is convincing enough. So the idea of, I think we need to take a more holistic approach to all of this rather than, like look at everything on scale rather than one thing at a time. So if we're looking at like the global sexual marketplace, we can say, well, what's the best practices for that? Well, you want to know why Fresh and Fit and like all these other channels are popular. It's because that conversation plays well at this moment in time. Later on, it might not have anything. We might not have anything to do with what we were talking about, the topics on those shows, because technology has changed the game so rapidly. It might be in women's favor. It might be in men's favor. People always ask me, like, would like male hormonal birth control, would like a male pill, would that change the game? I said, yeah, probably, but we've already gone past that point. So it would be changing the game as it is right now, as opposed to the game as it was back in like 1965. So you have to look at the sexual revolution as an experiment that's still ongoing. It's not over. We're still in the middle of the experiment right now in 2021, but we're still trying to answer these questions, and we're trying to come up with solutions based on what we think ought to be the right way to do it from like our 20th century perspective. And yet here we are, 22 and a half years into the 21st century, and we're still trying to catch up and figure out what marriage ought to be. And is it a man and a woman? Is it a man and a man? Is it an open marriage? Is it a closed on her end, open on his end? We're still trying to figure out what's the best practice and how should we rearrange and reform marriage. Meanwhile, AI is producing convincing pornography that keeps those guys still stuck in that sort of sedation, and they don't have any incentive to go out and change the world. When we look at like I think Ruddy, you were saying something about how, if you take a society of guys who are, say 18 to 28 years old, somewhere around there, and they're not getting laid, And if they don't have porn, or if they don't have, escapes, if they don't have some sort of sedation, yeah, they might radicalize, and they might, have a Arab Spring or something like that. That might happen if they're unemployed and they have nothing else to do, and they might as well just go, break shit. But if they have good, convincing alternatives that might be virtual alternatives to meet their sexual needs, they're going to be sedated because their escape life is better than their shitty real life. So they'll be stuck in that. And how does that affect society? How does that affect fertility rates? How does that affect marriage? How does that affect family formation and all that we think is so important right now? So.
I remember I was at a men's retreat for my church years ago, and the pastor was talking about the internet, right? Like, we're long past the internet, right? But that was when, there are obviously, all this happens in degrees, but when pornography just got scaled, like your 50 caliber machine gun you talked about, Rollo, right? Mm-hmm. And it's, if you think that's a big deal now and that's changed things, just wait until the Apple Vision Pro concept really just takes over the world, right? Everybody's going to be walking around like drones with these goggles on. Oculus Rift didn't pull it off, but Apple's a different thing. Apple, their products are successful beyond comprehension, and
so
we're just seeing version 1.0 coming out, and like the phones, and even the iPod, if you remember the iPod, right? From 20 something years ago. That changed everything to where everybody's got their earphones on, they're just in their own world. That's the point. And that's only going to get worse. What were you going to say about the 60s?
Well, to your point, there was a movie a long time ago called Cherry 3000 that probably nobody saw, a sci-fi movie. Yeah. And in it, there was an android, a female, that was so convincing that the hero goes through this desolate, post-apocalyptic world to get her back. And you think he's trying to save his girlfriend, but she's an android. Mm-hmm. There's a point at which there will be an android who has enough AI to be a convincing surrogate for another human contact.
Mm-hmm. The most common mistake in predicting the future is look at the last generation, and I think what's occurred over my lifetime is going to happen over the next lifetime. And the easiest and my favorite example is in the 60s, people said there'd be Soviet cities on the moon, because what had happened in their lifetime was the growth of the Soviet Union and the growth of aerospace technology. However, what happens instead is the next 30 years are a reaction to what happened last. And Americans try to actively not think we'll have a revolution and social breakdown, because that's something that's not inside our frame of reference. But if you look at the long span of history, those things are exceptionally common. Most societies in the world have revolutions every 15 years. And so I think as a person in the target demographic you guys are talking about, who knows a lot of young people, these sedation techniques aren't working. They work for a certain amount of time, but I only hear people over the age of 30 saying porn will forestall the dating crisis, because the under 30s who've lived through that know that it's nowhere near enough. And I think, I look at a bunch of different metrics that have consistently predicted social collapse and revolution. And I think we don't have time. It's going to be in the next 5 years, things are going to go off the rails.
And porn doesn't fix relationships and human connectedness. It only fixes sexual frustration, but it doesn't fix the other elements. Oh, yeah. And if you think that the relationship between men and women is simply sex, go on, that's not it, right? For most men, a woman is the only person they have a truly intimate relationship with, where they share their feelings and right? And so porn fixes one problem. It's a Band-Aid, but it doesn't fix the whole one, to Rudyard, to your point.
Well, I'll tell you what fixes the whole one. OnlyFans. that fixes the whole.
OnlyFans not a real relationship. It's still.
I understand that. I get asked this quite a bit. Like, people say, like, Rollo, why is it that guys are so hung up on OnlyFans? Can't they just go get off on porn for free on Pornhub? I go, yeah, but it's to your point.
So this is talking to the hooker.
This is talking to this is talking. Yeah, it's really to actually women who are OnlyFans, content creators. We don't call them hookers anymore.
Content creators, yes.
I literally, truly have never checked this out, so I want to understand what OnlyFans is.
And I'm going to show you a photo here, guys. I just have to share this.
This is beautiful women.
OnlyFans will be the example of how far our society fell. In 100 years, OnlyFans will be in textbooks as an example for how far our society fell.
OnlyFans is popular because it fills that need you were just talking about, which is the need for sort of like this human connection, even if it's a virtual connection. It's still a counterfeit. I understand that. But the reason why it's massively popular and massively, profitable, for a good percentage of women, is because it provides guys with that virtual girlfriend experience that you're talking about. They are willing to pay, like men are willing to pay small fortunes for the idea or the performance that somebody actually gives a shit about them on the other side of the screen. It's not about the sex. They can go get, it has to be somewhat sexual, don't get me wrong, but it has to, it's not the channels that do the best on OnlyFans are the girl who is, sitting in her apartment or doing whatever. And she looks attainable. She looks like she's a 7. She's not like this big, centerfold, big boobs, centerfold girl who looks like she could be like a 9 or a 10. It's the girl who looks like, I could have this chick. I could, if I there's a possibility that I might be able to get that girl. Those are the top earners on OnlyFans because they seem like
that need.
Error. And so that's why, like even the women who are OnlyFans girls, they're asking me, why is this so popular? Why am I making so much money? And the reason is it provides something that is beyond just the sexual. You have to see her tits. You still have to see her be sexual, but that's not the draw. The draw is that girl, the more money I give to that girl, the more she's going to care about me because they're profiting off of just what you said a moment ago, which is they're looking for something that's more than just the sex. And so there's a technology to profit off of that as well. So again, and that keeps that fantasy alive. It keeps that escapism that keeps guys sedated all the time. And so people wonder why like guys can sort of, simp for girls on OnlyFans. It's because it's not the sex side of things. Like when people say, oh, you're an incel is like the insult du jour of this decade, I guess. But what is incel? What does that mean? Involuntary celibate. And I've always argued this, there's no such thing as an involuntary celibate. If you have $300, you come up to Reno, I'll take you to the Moonlight Bunny Ranch, and you will no longer be an involuntary celibate. You could go be a voluntary celibate if you'd like, but you will not be involuntary because it's the 21st century. And if you want to get laid, you can get laid. That's not the point. The point is they want that connection, like you were saying. And that's why OnlyFans is so popular. And that's why guys would rather sort of wallow in their own self-pity. And that's why an incel is an incel, because he's not actually involuntary. He's voluntarily celibate. And so we need some sort of insult, and we need some sort of, so we can. So
Rollo, it sounds like you're saying this is only can continue, that the ability to not have a girlfriend and not be in a relationship, that ability is going to become easier and easier and easier. Is that what you guys are saying, Jason?
Oh, well, look, wait. I mean, what we haven't even touched on, Rollo touched on AI, and that's going to change everything. I talked about the Apple goggles, the Vision Pro thing, and that's going to change everything again. It's going to, all of these things just make it worse and worse and worse. OnlyFans will continue to proliferate. It's absolutely... That's just awful. I mean, it's just awful. It really is. And the fact that women are making so much money off of that is even more awful. And the fact that OnlyFans makes so much money off of that is just terrible. It's tragic, 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 tragic. But what nobody mentioned was the rise of the robots. I mean, that's coming. I mean, is there going to be any need for human connection anymore? I mean, well, of course there's a need for it, but is there going to be, I mean, there are going to be so many other options. And everybody's just going to become more insular, more in their own world. And it's just tragic what is happening to society and culture. It's awful.
Which means birth rates, which means our society. But you guys saw Stepford Wives, right? And the Stepford Wives didn't argue with you, didn't tell you were fat or stupid, didn't nag you, et cetera, right? So eventually, if there's a Stepford wife, then there's no reason for real procreation and the raising of families.
Yeah.
Well, and I got to also point out the fact that it's not just a male problem, it's also a female problem as well. So that's what I was going to say. Talk to us from that perspective, Rollo. And, when I talk about the robots, I mean, obviously females will use all of this stuff too, but it's obviously a different dynamic for them than it is for men. The number one problem that it's a constant theme on every show I do on Access Vegas or Fresh and Fit or whatever podcast, all these popular hold women accountable podcasts. The major frustration of most women is that they can't find a high quality guy. They can't find a guy who's worth marrying. They would love to get married. They have that maternal instinct.
They found him. They just discarded him 1,000 times. But go ahead.
But their standards are too high. Come on.
Are so bloody high right now because and think about it this way. If you've got a woman who is, more women are going to college, more women are making more money right now. I was reading an article right now saying that, and depending on the state, more women are making more money than men in those states. So it was like the wage gap thing, right? And I'm like, which has been thoroughly debunked. Thank you very much. But the idea that, you know, women are going to college at, you know, 60-40 for men, it's actually worse than that. If you look at graduation rates, it's not enrollment, it's who's graduating,
Right.
who out and who doesn't. Men drop out at much higher rates than women do. There is a you know, there's that's the education gap that's right there. There's the money gap. And so what happens is men who actually are the top tier men, the guys who make more money than these women do, there are far fewer of them than there are of women who want to get with those guys. So what does that do? Well, it creates a society where we go kind of back to like polygyny, but it's women inspired or women initiated polygyny.
Yes.
They are more willing to share sort of like the alpha male, the guy who is the high value. Whether they realize they are doing it or not is irrelevant. They're sharing the higher value guy and are more willing to do so because all the rest of the guys suck and they don't want to have anything to do with those guys. So they're more than willing to wait around or try to baby trap a high value guy, or they're trying to, you know, lock that one guy down in competition with 10 other women who that guy is just like happy as a pig in shit because he's got nothing but choice at that point. So
mid-tier and lower tier males don't have any choice.
Yeah, well, we call it the 80-20 rule, and it's not the Pareto principle like people want to misinterpret it. What it means is like 80% of men are deemed unattractive by women right now. It doesn't mean that the 20% that's left over are attractive. It means that those ones might be attractive. They might do. It's the 80% of guys who are just simply not even in the running at that point. And then of that 20%, maybe 4.5%, I'm going by the stats of Dr. David Buss here, but like 4.5% of those guys are actually attractive enough, high value enough that women will initiate something with those guys. So you're looking at 4.5% of the male population who are attractive enough for women to want to do like the Sadie Hawkins dance, right? They want to go and ask the guy to the dance kind of thing. And when we look at a society that's, I'm exaggerating here, but if you look at that if you scale that up to a societal level, what you're looking at is women who have become the men that they wanted to marry because men are untrustworthy. We've got this societal narrative that they're either Homer Simpson and they're goofs and you know, like laughable, you know, fun-loving dad who needs mom to save him from himself. And then you've got the guy who's the borderline abuser who might be like Tinder swindler, you know, not who he says he is. And then you've got the rise of like the millennial / Gen Z who is just simply incompetent and can't drive a stick shift, can't change a tire, can't tie a boat, you know, can't tie a tie kind of thing. And if those are the choices that women are convinced that they have to pick from, of course they're going to go to college. Of course they're going to want to provide for their own long-term security. And so they don't need men. They'll say they want men, but men become superfluous at that point. They can't get the guy that they want to get. So they'll complain all day long about the high value man not wanting to get with them. Well, the fact of the matter is they've sort of priced themselves out of the sexual marketplace as a result of this female empowerment narrative that's been going on really since the late 60s, early 70s up to now.
Rollo, let me just make a comment on that if I may, and then you can go on. But that pricing themselves out of the market is a really important dynamic to understand. And I didn't fully understand this for a while, but you know, a lot of there's a lot of backlash by women against these passport bros. Okay. And of course, you've all heard the narrative, right? Is, oh, you know, these guys just go to foreign countries because they they can't handle American women or Western women. We're too successful for them. We're too strong-willed. We won't be submissive little women, right? So there's that narrative, which is untrue, because the reality is you're just not attractive. You've turned yourselves into men, and there's no polarity, right? So there's that. But when women get highly educated and highly successful, they have this complete delusion that that will be attractive to men. Hardly any men at all are attracted to that. Okay. I mean, look, I make a lot of money, and I don't care if a woman makes any money. Okay. Like, I care that she's a good person who's got her act together, who's responsible. And yeah, to do that, she probably has to make a little bit of money, right? Like, she has to have a job that she can keep a job, be responsible, pay her bills, now in the old days, I wouldn't care about that at all. But, I care about it a little bit now because, it's going to be a woman who's been in the career world for a while. But what happens is, it's not that the men are intimidated by her success. It's that the women, being hypergamous, always need to marry up, right? So they keep pricing themselves out of the market and making their marketplace smaller, because pretty much any woman, when she's being honest, is going to tell you, I want a guy who makes more money than me. I want a guy who's ahead of me on the socioeconomic ladder. I want to marry up. That's natural for women, because throughout history, men were always the providers of resources. Argue with it if you want, women, you're just wrong. Okay, that's just simply the way it is. And so they keep narrowing their market and making it smaller and smaller. And so, it's like, go get a master's degree, you'll probably become extinct. Okay, go get successful, start your own business, you'll probably become extinct. Guys literally do not care about your money or your success. Very few of them do. You're just pricing yourself out of the market, not because he's intimidated, because you want someone who is doing better than you.
That's because you don't want him. He
Right,
doesn't.
you don't want him.
Or
Yeah.
needed, etc. Now,
Yeah.
all of this,
and
is
you're going to use Freud's displacement or projection or whatever it is, and you're going to displace that onto him, saying, "Oh, when the breakup happens or the get together never happens, you're going to tell your girlfriends, oh, he was intimidated by me because I make more money than him or I'm more successful than him." Actually, that's not true most of the time.
You
Most of
weren't
the time,
nice to
it's
him.
that you couldn't accept him. Okay.
Now, this is all true from the 60s and 70s and 80s. There was a group in my college called Students Social Opportunities Undiscovered But Possible. It spelled the acronym SOUP, and it was run by women, SOUP, and it was a giant bitch session about why can't we get men, and there were girls for every guy at that school when it first started out. And so a date looked like a 6-pack of beer and pizza at her place, and that was it. And they were mad about it.
Mhm.
Okay. It's only gotten worse. Women have always tried to marry up better themselves. I can't tell you the number of the giant women. I had a rule: you can't be bigger than me. All right. And I weigh 200 pounds. All right. That's okay. They wanted me to sleep with them, but they wouldn't go sleep with a fat schlub. This is innate. This is primal. This is all the way back. And now, because of social media, it is exacerbated. And because of the stories they've been telling themselves, I am woman, hear me roar, I could be 300 pounds and you should still want to sleep with me. It's only gotten worse. Ultimately, this is going to result in a fragmented society, right? Where men and women just, so like you said, don't need each other. And if technology enables that, it becomes more and more true. And then ultimately, we don't have families and babies and a cohesive society. Or is there a reset? What would it take for there to be a reset?
A war.
There has to be a reset.
I don't know that the reset's coming. But
the natural order always has resets. And the thing is, this is, even if the reset is the complete breakdown of society, that's a reset, because
Yes.
societies don't have stable birth rates. And if they don't have stable birth rates, they can't function. Men uphold every aspect of the society. They wage war, they build buildings, they do technological innovations. And the thing is, you don't give men an incentive to work, your society falls apart. After that, inequality is at the rate where we'll have a revolution. The rate of marriage is at the point where we'll have a revolution. And people forget how easy it is for society to fall apart because we don't see it in the West. But look at Venezuela, look at the Soviet Union, look at Somalia. We're only 3 or 4 Jenga pieces away from society falling apart. And it might happen in a century. I think I have no belief it will be that long. But then whenever the bureaucracy weakens and society grows weaker, men become strong, men become dominant again because they are the ones who do physical things with the outside world.
Let me ask you guys, how will people align around this civil war or this revolution? Because I don't think it'll be about race. I think we've pretty much driven racism out of our society. I was very active in the civil rights
that's not what the
movement
left
over
thinks,
20
but
years.
yeah.
But the belief that racism is everywhere still exists, right? So if it's not going to be over race, what are the two factions? If there's
It's pretty easy. What you would do is that you would, because I'm seeing this play out in real time, is that you would give young men an incentive to destroy the society. And as a leader of that, you would offer them sex as the end point. And young men staff the military. They are the force of the society. And the thing people forget at the left's coalition is there's no physical force there. No one on the left will hold a gun. And when you get situations where the left is incredibly arrogant and the right holds all the physical force.
So left will overturn a car. Come on, they will block. They will occupy a part of your town. So I'm a follower of Lewinsky, guys. So the left will take action.
We're a follower of Lewinsky. Guys, how much more time do we have?
I don't know, a few minutes, but let's go with Rollo. Okay. What do you got to say about that?
Couple of things. Back to your point real quick, but then we'll talk about the collapse of society. Wonderful topics first thing in the morning. Now, the first thing I was going to tell you is both a friend of mine and Jason is Robert Kiyosaki. And one of the first conversations I ever had with Robert and some of the ladies on his staff were the conversation of, why can't I find a guy? Rollo, how come I can't? All these guys don't know what they don't have jobs. They're not as successful as me. They're not as, they're not my equal. They're not economically attractive. Statistically speaking, women want to get with a guy who is, taller than them, smarter than them, more educated, funnier than them, makes more money than them, and more money, I mean, in the sense of like half again what they already earn. Whenever I do these shows, we'll go through what we call the female delusion calculator, and we'll say, okay, what's your ideal guy? How tall is he? What kind of money does he make? Is he overweight? And so using like CDC and Census Bureau statistics, there's this calculator that shows you what percent.
It's fantastic, by the way. Yeah.
Guy, their fantasy guy is in the US, and usually it's like a fraction of 1%, a small fraction of 1%, and that's the guy that they're looking for. And until they see it black and white in those numbers, and even after they see those numbers, they think they're going to beat the odds. Right?
Also, on top of that, I'm 6'4", I make over six figures. I used to be in better physical shape. If you fit all that, and that's like 0.5% of the population, there's still another 5 metrics.
Yeah. So there's so much that has to go into like the perfect guy. And that's I think as a result of our technology and social media and the godlike technology thing, I think that those expectations inspires a sense of hubris for women. Like nothing but the best will do. Never settle for anything less, girl, because you deserve it all, right? And so when women get to be like 35, 36, closing in on 40, and they wonder where the guy is, they have to have some sort of like rationalization as to why they're not meeting that particular guy. But the most common conversation I had with Robert Kiyosaki's girls, and it was like kind of a shock to the system, I think, is I said, well, look, guys who are your equal, which is actually more than you are, like better than you are, they're, first of all, those are the guys that you won't respect anybody who is not above you. Women can't look up to a guy who is their equal. And so I'm explaining this to them, and they go, well, what do I do? How do I solve this problem? And I said, well, you need to get in touch with your feminine side. You need to become more attractive on a sort of evolutionary, more visceral scale. I mean, get yourself in shape, be more accommodating, get in touch with your feminine side, which I think is ironic because back in the 70s, that's what we were telling men, is that they needed to get in touch with their feminine side while women are becoming more masculinized. So now we've come full circle, and women are like, so it goes against everything that they've been told since the time they were like 5 years old, watching Disney movies like Brave or whatever the hell, like you can have the world and just do it on your own, and you can provide your own security, and you are enough. That's the narrative. You are enough. You don't need anything outside of yourself. You don't need any, you don't need a man. You want a man, but you don't actually need a man. It's kind of a play on that, a woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle kind of thing.
Gloria Steinem, yeah.
So
guys, real quick, I did write that book, The Official Nice Guy's Guide to Dating. And in it, I have the Santa Claus list, which is all the criteria, this delusional idea, right? All these things go back to the 60s and 70s. I mean, I wrote that in late 80s.
Yeah,
okay. So it's not changed. It's just gotten worse.
It's got exacerbated as
it's dramatically worse. and I pulled the calculator up so we could do a quick calculation because I think it'll be interesting for the audience. But go ahead, Rollo.
Finish quick and then you could do it. So I'm talking to Kiyosaki's girls and they say, so what do I do? And I'm saying, well, you have to get in touch with your feminine side. And for a woman who has been told since the time she was like 5 years old and now she's 30 years old to get in touch with your feminine side so that you can be more attractive and more arousing to men is a repudiation of everything that they've been sort of raised to believe about themselves. And so their first response is this. So I have to dumb myself down to be a better, to be more attractive. I have to pander to men. I have to do something to please.
Why is female considered dumb as opposed to nice?
Right. And so, but they conflate that with, I have to dumb myself down, because these are women who've gone to college, who have, they've got their business career on point. Hell, they're rubbing elbows with Robert Kiyosaki, right? These are successful women as opposed, like they're the quote unquote alpha females, which doesn't exist, but they're the boss babes, right? And to have somebody, especially like me, tell them, well, you need to get in touch with your feminine side. Telling them that sounds like I'm saying, dumb yourself down, because everything they've lived their lives up to that point has been to sort of build themselves up because they can't trust men to provide for their own long-term security. And so to do so makes them very vulnerable. And they don't want to get with, well, what if the guy turns into an asshole? What if he, wants to marry me and then he starts fucking his secretary? What if? And I'm like, well, that right there is what's holding you back from finding a guy, because for the last, 4 generations, we've been telling women to, sort of masculinize themselves, whereas we tell men to get in touch with their feminine. And now we've come full circle.
They've become the worst part of men that they wanted to marry. They're not the best part of men.
For a frame of reference, my sister's a Maoist, and I know Jason and Dave met Kurt Doolittle, who's a friend of mine, and he established a series of principles to understand female relations and how women think, and also women's relational warfare, which he calls GSR, gossiping, shaming, and rallying. But I legitimately think Kurt's theories will change the world, and I might be, but I definitely do believe that. And one of the things Kurt says is that women have never had an evolutionary pressure towards practicality because men have protected them from the harshest parts of the world. And so when women deal with each other, one of toxic feminity's biggest frame of reference is what will make me popular. And so for toxic femininity, there's no distinguishment between what we want to believe and what the actual truth is. And so what ended up happening with feminism was it was very easy to pander and then repeat back these like platitudes that sounded nice, but over time they formed a hurricane and there was no way to counter it with actual evidence. And it's going to smash into a wall because society can't survive with it.
So the problem with feminism, really from the inception of it, but I mean, we could talk about it today. The problem with the idea of, well, women haven't had a sort of a necessity to be pushed towards practicality is because they're not wired that way. Evolutionarily speaking, a woman's brain is different than a man's brain. And one of the bigger conversations I get into is, when we talk about like male suicide, or we talk about like men they don't have enough friends anymore. And they're emotionally stunted. They didn't cry at the end of Titanic. There must be something wrong with these guys. It must be because society, it must be because of social constructionism has taught men to be stunted women. And the fact of the matter is that men simply do not have the hardware to do so. They don't prioritize emotion. They prioritize empiricism before anything else. Whereas women prioritize emotion before reason. Men prioritize reason before emotion, unless they're trained to do the opposite, or conditioned to do the opposite. But the idea of feminism, the idea of any ism right now, if you're looking at leftist stuff, if you can even make the case that, for conservatives as well. But the idea is that if you were to kick out the legs of like social constructionism, the blank slate, emotionalism, and subjectivism, if you were to kick any of those legs out of the stool, every ism collapses. So you take away social constructionism, which has been, like, nature versus nurture has been decided for the last like 20 years. We're just late to the damn party right now, because if you go and you look at like the 4 laws of behavioral genetics right now, it's a genetic factor. It's an evolutionary factor. Our brains are not the same. Men are not wired to emote like women, but they have to be taught and raised to be defective girls to become defective women later on in life. But the idea of, we have like the feels before reals society right now, that is the direct result of expecting men to perfect men is to make them into women, to make them more emotive, to make them more emotionally accessible, to make them more vulnerable, to in every single instance that we're looking at where it's like men are defective or are stunted as a result of the fact that they can't emote. The reason that they cite for that is because it's social constructionism. Social constructionism is bullshit. Okay. The blank slate is bullshit. All of this has been disproven since the late 70s, early 80s right now. And the minute we were able to sort of plot the human genome and we know more about our evolutionary biology, evolutionary psychology right now. Evolutionary psychology will destroy feminism. Evolutionary psychology will fundamentally destroy political ideology, religious ideology, all of this stuff. It will challenge it because it asks the right questions, not because it's dead nuts, like accurate, but it's accurate enough that asks the right questions. And as a result of that, when we look at the isms, when we look at leftist, we look at wokesies, we look at, conservatism, we look at all the isms, all of them trace back to social constructionism, the blank slate, emotionalism, and subjectivism, depending on what we're talking about. Kick out those fundamental basis of those isms, and all of it comes crashing down. So when we look at feminism, you also have to look at the biological aspect of men and women. It is unsustainable because the founding principles of feminism is that we have to actively disadvantage men to get equality. It's never been about equality.
Well, that's what it metastasized to. I mean, that's what feminism metastasized to. It originally, under suffrage, it was just basic rights for women. It has metastasized and lives fully in the way you're describing. It is anti-male. It is not pro-women. Absolutely. I was raised in that environment, and I was a blank slate guy. I mean, I believe I am woman here. I may roar in nature versus nurture. I want you to, and I am now in your camp.
You kind of follow the
like,
Warren Farrell path.
I got to your camp eventually. Okay. Now, what's interesting is it is okay to bash men for their being empirical and not emotional enough. It is not okay to say that maybe women should be more empirical.
Yeah.
These are masculine and feminine traits, but men and women exhibit both of them. Why can't we ask a woman to be more logical and be more empirical if we're going to beat men into the ground and say they must be basically girls?
We should probably wrap this up, but I agree with both of you, where the thing with the blank slate is scientists on the left don't even believe it. And as Kurt says, if you look at any policy for the left, how is it a way to abdicate responsibility for their group? And so the final endpoint of the left is you cannot judge a woman for anything. And so that's why they hate standards, because they could be judged against. Any final points for you guys? It was a pleasure having all of you.
I just want to, because I think it'll be so valuable for the listeners, I just want to show the female delusion calculator really quick. This only takes a second. It's so fast. But folks, if you're watching this on video, it's on the screen. If not, go to You type in female delusion calculator and you'll find it. There's also a male delusion calculator. It's interesting to look at both. This is based on IRS and census data. Okay, so this is not some subjective thing. It's just going to show you the size of your market, basically. And so if you're a female looking for a male, okay, let's assume you are 30 years old, right at that point of hitting the wall, okay, as much as you might not like to hear that, okay? So maybe your market for a man is going to be 32 to 47, right? We'll just take that as your ideal age range, okay? So I'm going to put that here. I'm going to go 32 to 4. I'll even go to 50, okay? Because I know what's going to come. It's going to be really small. And what's sad commentary on society is you have to check a box to exclude married men. As if, oh,
That's
I want
option.
the married men to be part of my marketplace, right? So I'm going to do the right thing and exclude married men, okay, for this female looking. Let's assume you're white, okay? So you're looking for a white guy, okay? And let's assume you want his minimum height to be 6 feet, which is pretty much what every woman's going to tell you, okay? Minimum 6 feet. And what is his minimum income? Say you want it to be $80,000 a year, right? Which, by the way, is not going to satisfy most women by a long shot, right, Rollo?
That's not the number they use. No.
I know. Okay, let's make it 100,000. Okay.
Jay, click exclude obese up there too.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, exclude obese men. Okay, so you don't want them to be obese. So here's the summary. You're a woman who's 30 years old. You want to find a man who's 32 to 50. Okay. You want him to be white. You want him to be 6 or more feet and not obese. Now, this doesn't mean he's not a little fat, but it's just he's not clinically obese, okay? And you want him to make $100,000 or more. So the question is, based on empirical data in the United States of America, based on census and IRS data, how big is your marketplace? Let's find out. We're going to click the find out button, and your probability of finding this ideal man who's not married, white, at least 6 feet tall, not obese, and earning $100,000 a year or more, your probability is literally 0.33%. Okay? According to statistical data, the probability of finding this person is 0.33. That is 0.58% of all white men in that age range. And your delusion score is that you're going to end up being a cat enthusiast. Okay.
Love it.
So,
Absolutely love it.
Aaron Clary's book is the male version. And that was a real, thank you,
Right.
Jason. That was a real wake up call.
book of
for-
numbers. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we use the Drake equation, which is the probability of meeting intelligent life in the universe that Carl
Yeah.
Sagan popularized, et cetera. And it was called N is a very small number. And in my book, I use something similar using this sort of thing to call it N is a very small number. What I love about this is incredibly visual, click and whatever, and it is based on empirical data. So there's no arguing with it.
And you know what?
There isn't any argument. And, let's just, since the marketplace is too small, let's assume this woman is getting realistic and she's going to compromise a bit. Let's lower the guy's height to 5'10", okay? And let's lower his income to, $75,000, okay? And let's see.
Now, what if you open the races, by the way, but go ahead.
Yeah, we're still going to have him be white guy. We're still going to have him be the same age, which is a pretty wide age range. 18 years of age range is pretty big, right? He's not going to be married. He's not going to be obese, but we lowered his height and his income. Let's see what your marketplace is now. Okay, it got a lot better. It's 1.1%. So,
4 times better.
yeah, it's 4 times better, but it's still terrible. You're going to be a cat enthusiast. So
And can you do this for Asians, by the way? Please do this for Asians.
Okay, so you want to
5% of the population. It's not going to change.
Okay, yeah. So in other words, Asian or any.
Everything else the same.
Okay. So find out, and here we've got 0.75. Okay, percent. So this is the problem: is that women they're just destroying their chances. Because in their 20s, when they're highly valued in the SMV, the sexual marketplace, as Rollo talks about, they're frittering away their equity because they're blowing off nice guys, that would make a good man, a good marriage, right? And then they get to a certain point and social media is always telling them they're beautiful because all the simps are commenting on their Instagram, right? And they'll never meet any of these guys. They have no idea how eligible any of those guys are. And they get to 30, 35, or as long as they can hold it. And
well, and they don't want to get married until they're 30, right? Because they want to live their life first. So they're not going to start till then and assume that the vistas will open up and it'll all come floating in. I used to ask the question to determine sanity of a woman. And the sanity question was this: I'm God. And if you tell me to do it at 8 o'clock in the morning, the perfect guy is going to knock on your door and you will never want to see another guy again the rest of your life. Yay or nay, do you want me to do that now? If you say yes now, it happens. And I can't tell you the number of young women who told me no. 60+% of women told me no. 60+ of men said yes. And they would say, well, what about this? He's going to keep me from going and having a job or going to Europe. No, perfect guy. Remember, I'm supposedly God. The perfect guy will show up, and they didn't trust it, and they wouldn't say yes. And the older they got, that changed. Young women, 90% said no. Older women, yeah, okay, well, maybe. So this has been true forever, and they want to believe that they're going to have what they want when they want it. If back to your point, your marketplace, it's never going to be better than when you're in your 20s, and yet you've decided to wait till you're 30 or 35 and think that that's going to happen for you. So this delusional thinking is self-destructive, and I don't know how you get the word out more other than podcasts like this.
I've seen this argument about 1,000 times on Fresh and Fit. If you click Fresh and Fit, there's a big chance that the conversation will be the guys there explaining this exact argument, and girls just don't care. Like, you can explain this to them and it's just, it won't process. And I think we'll have to have a lost generation of women in order to learn this lesson.
Amen.
Yeah, I was gonna say is that even when we use, like, Mike Sartain, my co-host on Access Vegas, we use this calculator quite a bit. And even when we show it, hey, black and white, the guy that you're looking for is a fraction of 1% of the population right now, they'll still say, never tell me the odds. I'm still gonna get that.
It's like Dumb and Dumber. You're saying there's a chance.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, what I've seen is that female friend groups often gas each other up. And so if you look at a female friend group, they'll get brunch or whatever, and then they'll leave it with an unrealistic understanding of what's going on in the world. And the thing is, the female friends are incentivized to basically gas their friends up because that lowers their dating chances by making them unrealistic. The reason hot girls like body positivity is so that fat girls don't lose weight and become competition.
Again, body positivity and all that stuff about, fat acceptance and everything, all based on social constructionism. Is subjective. Beauty is a patriarchal, structure, or social construct. You'll notice that all of the things that whenever women like complain about like men's fragile egos, or men only want to get like whenever Leonardo DiCaprio is nailing his next 25-year-old girl who he just cycled through. All that stuff really feeds into sort of that like female fear, existential fear narrative for women. But on every complaint that women have about men today is founded in social constructionism right now. So whenever it's like, oh, well, beauty is just a social construct, gender is just a social construct. What is a woman, right? When you got Matt Walsh talking about what is a woman, Matt Walsh doesn't like, there's a really easy way to just completely cut his documentary short. It's a social construct. You're talking about social constructionism. Take that away and you don't even have a question of what is a woman, because what happens is if anybody has to, if a woman or a guy who thinks he's a woman wants to explain objectively what is a woman and what is not, it forces that guy into conflicting himself or herself with social constructionism and the blank slate. Kick those things out and you no longer have that question. It's not entertaining anymore because the basis of it is on.
I've read thousands of pages on social justice theory, and it was one of those disappointing endpoints of my life where I understand the philosophy behind social justice better than a lot of left-wingers, but there's no gain because the philosophy is it's whatever we want. And so that doesn't follow a logical structure. And it's incredibly frustrating.
Intersectional feminism, feminism in general, intersectional feminism, if you look at social justice, if you look at anything that is sort of, and you'll see more of this come to light in the election cycle that we're about to enter into. Understand that all of those concerns and all of those issues and everything else is fundamentally based on social constructionism. So whenever I get into the argument about like whether abortion is murder with conservatives, or if I go and I say, okay, with a leftist or a woke, I say, what is the primary function of abortion? They want to resort to emotional arguments. They want to say, well, the Lord says, or they want to say, women should have the right to choose. That's not what I'm asking. What is the function of abortion, which is a fail-safe for bad reproductive choices? So essentially what you're doing is you're fighting for women's bad reproductive choices. If it's men who are conservative, who want to, talk about abortion, women don't want you to have a seat at the table because you don't have a uterus. Okay, well, that's a biological thing right there. But when I asked guys like Matt Walsh, I said, okay, well, if you think abortion is murder, are you willing to put women up for murder one who have had abortions? They don't want to confront that because it attacks their emotional argument, all of which are based on social constructionism and the blank slate. So if you kick those out, you no longer have that argument anymore, and you don't even really have the conversation. But what you do have is you have the data and you have the empirical, sort of understanding of how to form best practices, which neither side wants to enforce. They simply don't want to do it. They would rather talk about it and make more money in the conversations and the discussions and the outrage than actually solving a problem, because solving the problem would require action and work, and it would be really tough on both sides if they were going to do that. No one has the will to change it, and will never change until the meteor strikes or the war starts or whatever. The reset button will probably be something very violent and very uncomfortable.
Well said.
Yeah.
So to wrap things up, Jason, if you have any final thoughts, we'd like you kind of maybe to put a final pin on this, if you would.
Well, I just wanted to share the delusion calculator, but look, we are in a really, frankly, a tragic time in the world in many ways. I mean, technology has amazed us all, and I like to say it's an amazing time to be alive. But culturally, we are in an epic disaster. This is really a disaster, a cultural disaster, and it has got to be solved. I don't know how or if it ever can be solved. I want to believe the pendulum swings back and forth, but I don't see this pendulum swinging the other way. I just don't see it happening. So anyway, thanks for having us on, guys. Great show. Rollo, thank you for joining. You're just such a wealth of knowledge. And guys, thanks for having us on. Appreciate it.
We appreciate your perspective.
It was a pleasure. You guys were great speakers.
Thanks.
Thank you.